The US did not actually mediate the negotiations between India and Pakistan. They did that themselves. But my understanding is that the Trump administration did essentially intensify its push for the two sides to try to wrap things up. The reason I'm not surprised that the U.S. played a role is that it's done so before. I mean, as I'm sure you would know, I mean, there is a precedent, a very strong one, of the U.S. intervening diplomatically when you have these military crises. It happened in 2019, and it happened on a number of occasions before that, going back to Kargil.
Welcome to Dawn News English. I'm Danish Khan. The recent spasm of violence between India and Pakistan was one of the worst in recent memory. And on May 10th, US President Donald Trump announced to the world that he had played a key role in ending the violent confrontation between the two nuclear armed countries. To understand the US role and how it was perceived by India and Pakistan, I have invited Michael Kugelman to the show. Michael is a keen observer of South Asia and a South Asia columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. Thank you, Michael, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be back with you.
Yeah, I want to start our discussion by posing the following question. Were you surprised to see the recent escalation between India and Pakistan during May 6th to May 10th?
So, I mean, I was not surprised that we had this sudden crisis and conflict. I was surprised by the rapid escalation in the crisis and conflict. So, what I mean by that is that, as you know, for the last 4+ years, the India-Pakistan relationship had actually been in a fairly good place, fairly calm since a truce along the LOC was signed in 2021. But the pattern over the history of this relationship is that when things are fairly calm, it seems to only be a matter of time before something bad happens. And so, in that regard, I think those of us that study the relationship, we kept saying it's important not to be complacent about the relationship. It would only take one trigger to plunge things into crisis again, and that's indeed what happened. But the reason why I'm surprised about the nature of the crisis and the conflict and the rapid escalation, the rapid escalation in hostilities, is that what we've seen in the past, for the most part, since India and Pakistan went nuclear, is relatively limited uses of force, and we've seen that in recent years both sides have been increasingly comfortable using more conventional force under the nuclear umbrella. 2019 involved more force than 2016, but to so rapidly get to a point where you had each country, sending missiles and drones deep into the other's territory, hitting sites that included some military sites and some pretty sensitive sites as well. So that's why I'm quite struck. I mean, not too surprising that there was more uses of force deployed than in the previous crises, but the fact that they escalated so rapidly, that I found very striking and indeed very disturbing. The implications that could have for the next military crisis, I think, are quite stark.
Interesting, but now let me pose another question with the same premise. Were you surprised by the role of the US, especially a claim made by President Trump that he played a critical role in brokering peace between two nuclear armed countries?
Not surprised by the U.S. role. I think that we do need to uh, put out the caveat that my understanding is that the role that the U.S. did play, its intervention, its diplomatic intervention, was much less than what President Trump suggested. However, the U.S. did play a role. My understanding is that throughout the crisis, and this was very much in the public eye, the State Department, including Secretary of State Rubio, were in close touch with counterparts in both countries. And Rubio spoke to both Jaishankar and Dar twice, I believe, before the ceasefire was negotiated. And even though there's been a lot of talk about the inconsistent public messaging coming from the U.S. Throughout the crisis, the State Department was pretty consistent in the sense that it was always saying that we're very engaged, we're very close, we're not watching this from a distance. So there was that. And so what happened, as I understand it, is that once the escalation became quite serious, once we got to a point where you had the missiles and drones coming into each country, And in particular, the once Pakistan's government signaled publicly that it was going to convene its National Command Authority, coupled with the targeting of the Norcon base, I think this is when the U.S. decided to make a bigger pitch. The U.S. did not actually mediate the negotiations between India and Pakistan. They did that themselves. But my understanding is that the Trump administration did essentially intensify its push for the two sides to try to wrap things up. The reason I'm not surprised that the U.S. played a role is that it's done so before. I mean, as I'm sure you would know, I mean, there is a precedent, a very strong one, of the U.S. intervening diplomatically when you have these military crises. It happened in 2019, and it happened on a number of occasions before that, going back to Cargill. So in that sense, it was only a matter of time before the U.S. got involved.
And building on this, the way President Trump announced that he has played a critical role, it was received very differently in both countries. In Pakistan, the Pakistani Prime Minister and other officials thanked Trump and appreciated his role, whereas in India, Indian Prime Minister Modi did not mention Trump or didn't thank him, and then later on, they downplayed that Trump played a key role. So, how do you see this? Why this divergent approach by two countries?
Well, I think the main explanation is that India has always been very sensitive about any type of external mediation in its bilateral disputes and crises with Pakistan. India is not opposed to external mediation, and there has been successful external mediation in the past, not just in terms of mediating crises and conflicts, but also talks toward a better end. So, we know that the UAE, for example, helped mediate the talks leading to the 2021 LOC truce. But since India is sensitive to external mediation, it does not want that mediation being broadcast to the world in real time. And that's essentially what happened in this case when you had President Trump very soon after the ceasefire was agreed to, going public with his Truth Social post. And I think this is why India reacted the way it did, that it just did not want to have to acknowledge that the US was playing that role. Whereas, with Pakistan, it's very different. Pakistan, as you know, for forevermore has sought to get the world and the international community involved in this broader crisis and dispute with Pakistan in the hopes that, among other things, that could really force India to agree to talk about the Kashmir issue. So I think it's really that India is just very sensitive about this whole idea of external involvement, and it does not by any means want it to be put out there publicly. And in the past, that has not happened. I mean, typically, U.S. officials have not gone public. Even in 2019, as I recall, you didn't have President Trump, who of course was that was his first term, coming out and saying, "Well, we just ended this crisis. We averted a nuclear war." Of course, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State at the time, he came out with a book a few years ago. He made the claim then, but of course that was 4 years later, and it was a very different context.
And do you think will President Trump take a note that India downplayed his role and Pakistan kind of celebrated his role? Especially, I mean, there's a lot of talk in media that he understands things in a more personal way rather than a broader strategic interest. So, what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, President Trump, and we know this from when he was the president the first time, he just takes a very unorthodox approach to everything, including statesmanship, diplomacy, foreign policy on the whole. And he would not necessarily have known, or quite frankly, not necessarily have cared about the broader context and the complex dynamics underlying India-Pakistan relations, including the fact that India doesn't like to have third-party actors talking about their mediation. So, this his Trump's comments have really hurt U.S. relations with India. But I don't think President Trump meant that. He didn't wish any harm on the relationship. He didn't mean to insult India or its leaders, not at all. But I think he just was not aware of the context or chose to disregard it because, he's of course someone that wants to be front and center, especially when it comes to, being seen as the person that helped end a very serious crisis or conflict. And I think that's what we can chalk this recent situation up to.
Yeah. And for our audience outside India, help us understand why there is so much resistant or resistance in India in terms of hyphenation with Pakistan. Like, what's the story behind this? Because I haven't seen same response in Pakistan. Actually, in your response, you mentioned Pakistan is okay with being hyphenated with India, but in India, there seems to be extreme reluctance to be hyphenated with Pakistan. And is it recent or it has been there for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, India has long sought to not be hyphenated with Pakistan, and it took a while to get many of its partners, including the U.S., to agree to dehyphenate. I mean, it really wasn't until the Clinton administration, which of course was in the 90s, when you had that, and that became even more of a strong U.S. policy once the U.S.-India relationship really took off in the Bush years, and then certainly in the Obama years. Basically, India does not want to be it doesn't want to be essentially clubbed with Pakistan. It feels that it's a success story, that it's a rising power and a top global economy. It's a strong country, and it doesn't feel that it's fair to be linked to Pakistan, a country that it views as, quite frankly, not as strong or powerful or influential as India. And I think more recently, this has become a sensitive issue when the matter of terrorism comes up. I mean, as you know, India's view is that Pakistan sponsors terrorism, terrorist attacks in India, including the most recent one, which Pakistan, of course, has vigorously denied it had any role in this attack. But I think recently India is very sensitive to this idea that the world would look at India and Pakistan in the same way, including when it comes to, focusing on getting both of them to do the same things, like de-escalate tensions or talk or something like that. When in India's view, Pakistan is sponsoring terrorism and India is victimized by terrorism. So it's obviously a very provocative perspective from a Pakistani lens, understandable from a Pakistani perspective. But this is generally how India sees things. In a nutshell, it feels that it's well on its way to becoming a global power, and it does not want to get dragged down in this dispute or this issue of Pakistan, so to speak, because it feels that would just distract it from its goals and would undercut its well-earned reputation in its view as this rising global actor, a key global actor.
Mhm. And with the changing geostrategic conditions in the region, where the rise of China and potential new Cold War 2.0 between the US and China, maybe India now has a better strategic relations with the US. But as you're probably aware of, on May 21st, five school children were killed in a suicide attack in Khuzdar district of Balochistan. And Pakistani officials have claimed that these attacks are carried out by uh, quote unquote Indian proxies. Now, do you think this perception can become more wider in the international community, that there is more of a two-way relationship in terms of supporting these non-state actor proxies?
Right. I mean, this is certainly an allegation that Pakistan has sought to, or had not sought to, has brought to the international community on many occasions in recent years, particularly through what it's, as you know, described as these detailed dossiers. Hasn't gotten much traction, quite frankly, to this point. But as we now know that both India and Pakistan have put together these delegations of senior politicians and retired diplomats who are going to go around the world trying to get international buy-in for their perspectives. And I think Pakistan, a big part of its pitch will be about this idea of India sponsoring terrorism in Pakistan. And indeed, I think Pakistan will provide the context of recent weeks and recent days, including this recent attack that you alluded to, which of course comes so soon after the military crisis ended. I mean, we'll see if that gets traction now. If it gets more traction now, this view of India sponsoring terrorism than it had in previous years. But I think it's impossible to look at the India-Pakistan relationship and India-Pakistan tensions without looking at the proxy issue. And I think there are some that would argue that if we look at the origins of the crisis that was triggered by the Pahalgam attack, that one has to look at the Jafar Express attack, the BLA attack on the hijacking and attack on that train in Pakistan. And of course, many in Pakistan believe that India was
Mm,
sponsored that to some extent. and that then Pakistan
Hmm.
then retaliated in kind, and now you have this BLA attack, this horrific attack that targeted the children. So, I think this is, if we're thinking about how this situation could play out, there's a ceasefire, of course, between India and Pakistan, but there's always ways for each side to try to send messages in ways that may not be terribly overt or not overt at all. And I think it's quite clear that India has undertaken some targeted assassinations of militants in Pakistan in recent months and in recent weeks. I think that's another tactic that we could expect to be used. So it's going to be a very precarious situation. We should not be lulled into complacency by the ceasefire, which I'm sure will hold. But given other dynamics, you're looking at a pretty fraught situation between the two.
Yeah, and just to clarify, both countries have officially denied any involvement in these non-state
Yes.
actor violent events. So now you mentioned these delegates which are visiting, I'm assuming US and other countries in the global north. And it seems like the argument is, or at least the perception is, it's the battle of narrative or the discourse, and how can we convince folks in the US or in Washington or in London or in Paris. But uh, from a more realist perspective, isn't it about the geostrategic interests of the countries in the global north, including the US? It's not just a matter of discourse or I'm looking at it wrong, or how do you see it?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I should clarify, unless I'm mistaken, um, India's delegation is going to be traveling to every corner of the world based on what we've seen out there. Whereas Pakistan's delegation, I think they've got more limited. I think they're just going to mainly target the Western capitals, certainly Washington and so on. So, I think it's interesting. What I've been arguing is that the war on the battlefield, the very brief conflict in the battlefield has ended, but the battle of narratives has really picked up, and it will as these delegations start doing their activities. And I think that India at this point is losing the narrative battle, which might seem hard to believe. But initially, right after the Pahalgam attack, much of the world rallied to India's support, condemned the attack, expressed solidarity with India. But then once the military crisis began and once it became clear there was serious escalation, the international community's messaging and focus turned to escalation concerns and fears of nuclear escalation risks. And that's when the focus turned to de-escalation. And you didn't have key capitals talking as much about terrorism and Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. And that's certainly an advantage for Pakistan. So I think that India will be banking on the global clout that it has, the influence it has, the access that it has. I mean, I think given what India is, I mean, given it's the fastest growing major economy, one of the biggest economies in the world, its membership in key clubs, the big relationships it has with so many players, it's going to be able to connect with a lot more stakeholders than Pakistan will. So that'll be a disadvantage for Pakistan. But I think that for Pakistan, for India, what will be a challenge is to get the international community to accept the seriousness of the terrorism threat that India faces while also not sort of like getting the international community to put aside its fears about nuclear escalation. I mean, they're both concerns for the international community, terrorism and nuclear escalation. India doesn't want the world to be focusing on the nuclear escalation and the conflict risk issue. It only wants the focus to be on Pakistan-sponsored terrorism and how the world could work with India to combat it. Whereas, with Pakistan, I think the focus will be very different. It'll be to focus the attention on India's own involvement in sponsoring terrorism. This is the Pakistani allegation that India denies, as well as the Kashmir issue. Pakistan is going to try to get the world to focus attention on Kashmir. Pakistan has repeatedly failed to succeed. One reason for that, well, there are many reasons for it. One big reason for it is that much of the world wants to have a good relationship with India. It sees it as an important market investment partner, strategic partner, and is happy to defer to the Indian preference to not get involved in the Kashmir issue. So, you point to geostrategic interests. Certainly, I think that much of the international community is going to be very careful about not wanting to do anything when this delegation is going around the world to do anything that could, risk upsetting relations with India over the longer term. But at the same time, those concerns about nuclear escalation will remain quite prominent. And even if Pakistan likely won't succeed in getting the world to agree to launch a pressure campaign on the Kashmir issue, I think a win that Pakistan could likely expect is to get this uh, amplification or essentially confirmation from the world that it views the subcontinent and the Kashmir issue as a flashpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially the biggest casualty of any confrontation between two countries is most often are the people of Jammu and Kashmir on both sides of the
Yes.
line of control. Now, another issue of um, contestation between two countries or a flashpoint potential is the recent move by India of putting Indus Water Treaty in abeyance. And uh, I'm not a legal expert, but what I've read, it seems like India cannot unilaterally do it. So do you think there will be some international pressure on India to respect international law and these global treaties, such as Indus Water Treaty, which was brokered by World Bank?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the logical question is what role could the World Bank have? Because indeed it co-signed the treaty and mediated it. I think that we'll see. I suspect that one of Pakistan's core goals is to try to get the World Bank to agree to take a position. But I suspect that the World Bank would view its own role as very narrowly defined. There's nothing in the treaty, so far as I know, that gives the World Bank the right or the leverage or the leeway to, get involved when if something like this happens. I mean, obviously, the treaty did not envisage that one country would back out of it because that was not what is not in the spirit of the treaty by any means. But there's built-in mediation mechanisms stipulated by the treaty. So the expectation is that India would have resorted to, talks, would have sought media assistance from an external player, an external mediator, after working bilaterally with Pakistan to try to settle its unhappiness with the treaty. But that's not in the cards. But I don't think the World Bank would feel that it's its duty to push India to abide by the strictures of the treaty and reconsider its decision to suspend it. Instead, try to work things out with Pakistan through talks. India doesn't want to talk to Pakistan. So I think that Pakistan will get sympathy from much of the world in terms of the concerns about the broader implications for Pakistan of India backing out of it. But I don't think that we're going to see the international community in terms of governments, international organizations playing an active role in trying to get India to reconsider its decision. But quite frankly, I think it's all for naught. My sense is that India had been looking for an opportunity, an excuse for a number of years to back out of the treaty. I don't think it has any intention of coming back to it. It says it'll come back to it once the issue of terrorism is done with, but we know that's been a fraught issue between the two for many years.
Mhm. Now, focusing on Pakistan, there's a growing perception in mainstream of Pakistan that because Pakistan is a close ally of China and a geostrategic partner, at least in the region, that's why the coziness between the US and Pakistan is not no longer possible. But then on the other hand, we have seen that India has been a close ally of Russia and now the US. Even still, the recent data showed that India gets a lot of its military gadgets from Russia. So, how do you understand? Is it possible for a country like Pakistan to have balanced relationship with both the China and the US?
Yeah, I mean, this is what Pakistan repeatedly claims its objective is. I would argue that in Washington, there's a pretty strong perception that Pakistan is in the Chinese camp, and that it's simply being polite by saying that it wants to make relations work with the U.S. as well. But honestly, things have changed a bit in recent weeks. I mean, we've seen the Trump administration uh, telegraph its willingness to work with Pakistan on a number of areas, whether you're talking about counterterrorism, of course,
Mhm.
President Trump, gave a shout out to Pakistan for helping track down the ISK operative involved in the Kabul airport attack that killed some American troops, along with a very large number of Afghans in 2021. We know that the Trump administration is very interested in critical minerals in Pakistan. It's also interested in crypto related matters in Pakistan. So you have that, and the this crisis, this conflict, and especially the aftermath of it, has injected some tensions into U.S.-India relations because New Delhi is not happy with the messaging coming from Trump. But I think at the end of the day, I do think we're going to see a reversion to the norm. So the China factor is unavoidable. So long as US-China competition continues, there's going to be limited opportunities for the US and Pakistan to really grow out their relationship. There's so many strategic and commercial imperatives for the US and India to both agree that they want to make their relationship work. Trump administration is full of big backers of partnership with India, including Trump himself. So I think that things will settle. Things will eventually settle down, and we will see the patterns of recent years come back into play. The U.S. will want to have its relationship with Pakistan, but I do think it'll be limited, and it will want to continue to focus on growing out its partnership with India. But what I will say there is that if Trump continues to pile on, if he continues to make these comments about Kashmir and continues to brag about the ceasefire and so on, the question is, if that keeps on going, I think that India's patience might be tested. I mean, India might be inclined to just shrug off what's been happening as, Trump being Trump. But if he keeps doing it, and especially if others in the administration, the Trump administration, make similar comments, that's when I think you have to worry about some serious issues or challenges for the U.S.-India relationship.
No, no, building on this point, and it's not the first time that the Trump has mentioned Kashmir, because I remember when Prime Minister Imran Khan was in office, he came to the Washington and he met with Trump, and then when he got back to Islamabad, he said that he won a major trophy like a World Cup because Trump is willing to mediate on Kashmir. So there's something going on there. So do you think it's realistic? And especially, I think there are like positive vibes in Pakistan regarding Trump's mediation on Kashmir. But how realistic is it in your understanding?
Yeah, so you're right that this is not the first time Trump has called for mediation. I believe when he was president the last time, he even said at one point that Modi had asked him to mediate it, which is clearly not at all true because that's the last thing that Modi or any Indian leader would ask the U.S. or anyone to do. So I think this is a case of Trump being intrigued by the intractability of the Kashmir issue. He knows not too much about the wider context, but he knows enough to know that this is a big flashpoint. It's something that has really, you know, dragged the two countries, India and Pakistan, down, and he's intrigued by that. And he wants to, because he sees himself as the ultimate deal maker and peace broker. He wants to, be seen as the guy that's willing to try to take a crack at that. So I think that's what explains why we've seen these comments of his in recent years. I don't really think there's going to be anything. I mean, I can't imagine this would require a radical change in Indian policy. India's view, as you know, is that since it revoked Article 370, Kashmir is off the table. There's nothing to discuss unless the discussion is about Pakistan administered Kashmir. This is India's perspective. And indeed, I mean, Rubio, he had said after the ceasefire that the two sides had agreed to talks on a quote broad set of issues at a neutral third site, a neutral third country, presumably somewhere in the Gulf. But I can't imagine how India would have agreed to that. So the notion of the US or anyone mediating talks between India and Pakistan on Kashmir, to me, it's completely, you'd have to suspend your disbelief in a really big way. So I think it's really a case of putting the cart before the horse.
Now, in terms of, I want to end on somewhat positive note, and by that I mean normalizing possibility of normalizing relations between India and Pakistan. And here, let me build an argument here, and that is India sees itself as an emerging economic power, and given its large size and its growing economy, it is one of the major economies in the world. But that also requires stability and peace in the region, not just within borders, but in the neighboring countries. So, is there uh, a rationale or logical approach that leads to normalization between India and Pakistan, and that would then mandate some sort of a compromise? And I don't know whether that's on the issue of Kashmir or some broader set of issue, but and here both the US and China can play a positive role because it's also in the interest of China as well that there's a regional stability.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think it's a possibility. You would need the right brand of leadership on both sides to make a serious push for normalization. You'd need leaders that would have the courage and the vision to push for peace. And we've seen that we have had some possible leads in the past, and of course, the Musharraf Manmohan Singh pathway is the last one that was there that we know of. But we know that that didn't get very far in the end, mainly because of the Mumbai attacks. So what does that leave you? Unfortunately, it doesn't leave you with much in terms of hope for the future. I think that we have to sort of tone down our expectations, and I think focus on hoping that what dialogue continues to take place between India and Pakistan continues to take place. We know that the Indus Waters Treaty has been suspended, and give the treaty stipulated that each side meet once a year or twice a year to exchange data on river flows. That's not going to happen anymore. But there are still some bilateral treaties between the two that stipulate regular discussions, and these are in effect, and that includes, exchanging information about nuclear installations. It includes exchanging information about, the prisoners that each country holds from the other country. You have to hope that continues. You also have the hotline between the DGMOs, which has never been interrupted so far as I know, and that continued to be used during this recent conflict. It was used again right after the ceasefire. Got to keep that alive as well, so to speak, because I would argue that the space for dialogue and diplomacy has really shrunk given everything that's happened. I mean, we talk so much about the conflict, but let's remember that there's a ceasefire, but the all the other punitive steps that were taken remain in place. The Indus Waters Treaty suspension, the ending of all trade, including through third countries, the border, the Wagah-Atari border remains closed, so far as I understand. And so that's where, I think you really have to worry about prospects for discussion and for prospects for dialogue. So you have to hope that what little exchanges continue to happen will indeed continue further down the road. I just worry that it's only a matter of time before there's another crisis, another military crisis, and that one I fear could be even more escalatory than this one was, given this pattern of we've seen that we discussed before of each country becoming increasingly comfortable using more and more force under the nuclear umbrella.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for sharing your perspective, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Dawn News English.